Welcome everybody. I want to welcome you to our Sustainable Development Goals webinars on green homes and homelessness, the challenge of equitable and sustainable housing in 2020. I'm Karen Brown, and with my colleague Katie Pelican, I'm co-leading the University of Minnesota's Sustainable Development Goals initiative, and this webinar is one of our projects. Next slide, please. So during the webinar, we ask that you give questions for the panelists in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we will moderate those questions later in the session. The webinar is being recorded and will be available at the link you see on your screen now. And if you have any trouble with your Zoom during the session, please check the Zoom Help Center, and we will also be watching the chat in the Q&A. Next slide, please. Before we welcome our presenters today, I want to say a little something about the Sustainable Development Goals initiative that the webinar series is part of. Next slide, please. The Sustainable Development Goals are a set of 17 global goals that were established with nations around the world in collaboration with the United Nations to help propel the world toward a more sustainable and just and peaceful future. And you can see here that the goals cover the wide range of topics related to sustainable development. Next slide, please. The approach we're taking in the Sustainable Development Goals initiative at the University of Minnesota is to really focus on issues that are important in a local to global context. So we're looking at Minnesota state priorities and looking at how the University of Minnesota's work can help support those priorities. We're also looking to support and to build on the work of teams and interdisciplinary groups within the University of Minnesota, including a number of our interdisciplinary centers. We hope to build on that existing work to both expand it and enhance it. Next slide, please. Initially, we're doing several things as part of the initiative. One is documenting and supporting the impact of work at the University of Minnesota related to the goals. So for example, we're mapping our existing work related to each of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're looking at participating in some external rankings and reporting processes to show the impact of the work that we're doing. We're also supporting networks and innovation labs or hubs within the University of Minnesota on different goals to bring interdisciplinary groups together and connect them to community, government, and industry partners to increase collaboration both inside of the university and outside. And then finally, we're putting together a set of tools and communications. So these webinars are one of those. We also have a variety of other resources available on the website at the university that's part of the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance, which is the unit supporting our work. Next slide, please. So this initiative, as I mentioned, is something that links the local to the global. And today's topic on housing is a really important one. We're going to be focusing on what's happening in Minnesota today and connecting that to the broader picture of the SDGs. I'll turn over the session now to my colleague, Katie Pelican, to introduce our panelists.
Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Pelican. I'm co-leading this effort and welcome you to this webinar. So today we're going to be hearing from three people, experts in the field of housing, but also people on the front lines of trying to deal with some of the crisis in housing that's occurring in our states. They come from three different areas of work and from both within the university and outside the university. So I'm very excited to hear this mix of views on the status of housing and how it affects people's health, people's well-being, and some of the challenges that we face as communities around housing. So with that, I'm going to go to our first speaker. Colleen McDonald-Diouf is the CEO of the Community University Healthcare Center. This is, we fondly known as CUC here at the University of Minnesota. This is our community face for healthcare at the university. She has a background in international education, but with her work with CUC has been on the front lines of dealing with health and housing for the last 5 years. She has a personal commitment to solving these complex problems. So I look forward to hearing her perspective on housing and in relation to her work with the CUC Clinic today.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for the invitation. So my name is Colleen McDonald-Joof. As you heard, I'm the CEO of a department within the University of Minnesota that's also part of the Office of Academic Clinical Affairs called the Community University Healthcare Center, or CUC. We are a community health center, and a community health center is defined federally by a patient majority governing board that shares partnership with the university for healthcare. And our center is one of 1,700 community health centers across the country, but one of a very few number that are linked to universities. So we have the unique opportunity to leverage the university's strengths around research and innovation. And then we as a community center leverage the community strengths. We kind of bring those together at our center. We serve about almost 12,000 people annually through 63,000 visits. We are truly local to global. Our patients come from all walks of life and lived experience. Over 80% are people of color, immigrants, refugees, or Indigenous people. And we have a long-standing commitment to the community. We're located on the corner of Bloomington and Franklin in South Minneapolis, and grew out of a need in the 60s that residents identified as that the university needed to be more present around infant mortality in the Phillips neighborhood. And that particular neighborhood is sort of the gateway for new and immigrant and refugees who have come to Minnesota. So I'll talk a little bit more about the services, and then I'll talk about how it connects to health. So we offer primary medical services, mental health services, wide range of mental health services, some which are community-based, as well as dental services. We have an on-site legal clinic that provides pro bono services to our clinics, our patients, as well as wraparound care coordination and other services, and substance abuse treatment services. So the issue of housing, and I always say that housing is health, that you can't separate the need for housing from health outcomes and health well-being. And I want to talk a little bit in several ways that we see that play out amongst our patient stories. So I can give one example of one of our board members who's been a patient in our clinic for over decades and is an older woman who's been unstably housed now for several years. And the amount of challenge in finding and filling prescriptions and having stability has been a real challenge for her, because she's been denied or often not been able to find housing. And so we see sort of three, I would say I'm going to just talk broadly about three sort of buckets of issues related to housing. One is that there's a lack of housing and housing support services that are needed. So for some people, there are additional services that are needed to keep people stable. So where we see our patients thrive is when they have, particularly for our patients who have severe mental illness, is when they're in a supportive housing structure that's offering different resources, maybe some peer support services or other recovery services to keep them sort of whole and engaged, and to maintain their housing and not lose it. So I think that's one level that we see, and particularly for people who have substance use disorder and or major mental illness, having systems and structures that support them in their housing is particularly important. So again, not just the physical placement of housing, but also those supportive services around. We also see a lack of, I would say, affordable and often there's a lot of inadequate housing. And what I mean by that is housing that is designed for, a 2-bedroom apartment, but you have a wide range of family members, almost 20 family members living in that 2-bedroom apartment. So the housing is adequate, as it doesn't always take in the cultural responsiveness or defined units of family that we see with our communities. And so that inadequate housing leads to other issues of overcrowding and lack of access. And we're particularly seeing this as another huge issue right now with the COVID pandemic, because the idea of being able to socially isolate if you're sick or having symptoms for many of our patients is not possible. Then I also want to talk about what I'm going to refer to as unsafe housing, and this is substandard housing. This is where our legal partnership in the past has been really helpful. So you could have a family where the child has asthma, and really asthma is due to the lack of good air duct quality or mold located in the apartment or housing that the child. So the child ends up going several times to the ER and needs lots of medications, but the fundamental root cause issue is that the housing isn't safe, right? So it's substandard, there's mold, there's other issues, or maybe there's some security issues. Some of our patients talk about going up into the high rises in the stairwells and being groped as they're going out or in and out of their buildings. So I would call that unsafe housing. And again, that has also outcomes, both health and mental health related for patients. So in those areas, I wanted to touch on a little bit about what we've been seeing at our clinic recently. We really got involved, I would say, more in trying to find innovative solutions or look into innovative solutions around housing, particularly after we were across the street of the first encampment in 2018. Our clinic, Koo Clinic, was located across the largest Minneapolis encampment at that time in Minnesota in 2018. And the encampment, otherwise known as the Wall of Forgotten Natives, was really particularly, I would say, a confluence of historical racism and loss of indigenous land, the substance use and opiate epidemic hitting our communities in South Minneapolis, but disproportionately people of color and indigenous people, and then racism or lack of affordable housing. And not only affordable housing, I want to say affordable housing with supportive services. And so we saw that sort of happen, and we got very active in providing services across the street to folks. And we saw some different models pop up at that time that were innovative. One was the navigation center. So many of the housing agencies worked really closely to get folks connected in housing as much as possible. And the barriers for housing then became even more clear. If you have a felony, how long it is, or your criminal record, how hard it is to get housing, how hard it is to pull to find housing for an extended family member. So maybe sometimes the grandmother's the caregiver, they'll move the family, they won't bring the grandmother into the housing. We saw other issues, other barriers that were really creating problems. So we worked very creatively and collaboratively with Hennepin County during that time to support access to housing in that way, as well as other agencies were as well, and to provide healthcare. The other piece that we're seeing, like I said, is with COVID, with this inadequate housing. And for most of our communities, we're seeing a whole switch over to telehealth visits. But for some of our communities who are either are unsheltered or living in this overcrowded housing, confidential visits are not always possible. So we are, again, creating another gap in access to care where we want people to stay home and we don't want them to put themselves at risk in potential infectious areas. But for some people, that's not possible. So there's the issue of inadequate housing. And again, like I said, also housing that's not culturally responsive. We continue to be challenged with this issue as we try to work with different agencies such as the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority about how we can really integrate health into housing where it works. And some of the models in actually last year in 2019, we received some funding from AWACA for the Bold Ideas grant. And so we worked with the College of Design, Cura, as well as public health, and really looked at what models work and engaged community members in several roundtables about what are the issues and where do they see the impact of health. And one of the takeaways was that having a supportive, caring person in their lives to help keep them throughout the transition of homelessness and help them really confront and work through any issues they had with housing or health was critical. And so we saw that in some of the findings. We also saw different models that different cities have taken, some which have been what they call scattered site, which is different housing throughout the community. Or one, we're also seeing the emergence of what they call stacked housing, where you have a clinic and then apartments on top, and that could include permanent as well as transitional or other sorts of housing options. The other one too that other folks might talk about later is also the use of tiny homes as well. So fast forward today, just going to check where I'm at with time here. We are continuing, as you know, to see sort of the, because of the pandemic and the economic downturn, and even greater, I would say, exacerbation of housing and the need for more affordable housing and it not being present. And so we saw over the summer several encampments which still exist, and we saw at our clinic now, we have they're calling it the Wall of Forgotten Natives 2020, because we've seen the reappearance of the Wall of Forgotten Natives due to the fact that basically people have been moved around out of the parks, evicted out of the parks, and now are again trying to find a place to stay. There are temporary and permanent solutions that are in the works, but are they quick enough? Are they going to be able to help people stay healthy and in their housing? And we see, again, just a constant barrier to people's health and their mental health when they are forced to live in places of instability and fragility and vulnerability. So we're doing what we can right now across the street, and we're gonna be doing a pop-up mobile testing and vaccination event, as well as other services event, sort of a community outreach fair for the members of the residents of the Wall at our clinic this weekend, actually this Saturday. And when we kind of explored how do we continue to support housing, I think what we're seeing as a gap or potential opportunity is to see more community health center and health integration into housing. We're seeing that as an area that has some growth and innovation. And I think that's where we can really bend the curve and improve the health of folks. So with that, I think I'm at my time. So
great. Thank you so much, Colleen. That was really insightful and helpful to hear about some of the challenges you're facing and some of the challenges of housing, how communities can really suffer in terms of health related to housing instability. Our next speaker is Jacob Manns. He is a professor, an architect, and from our School of Design. And he has been working with rural communities as well as urban communities in trying to work with communities to address housing insecurities. And so today he's going to be talking about some of that work and what it means for design and for the communities themselves. Jacob.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Colleen. It's funny that the emphasis on health and housing is also one of the kind of key things that got me into a number of the projects that I'm focused on with housing right now as well. And I wasn't going to talk directly about it, but maybe as a way of connecting some of the different talks. I've been doing a lot of work over the last 5 years or so with Indigenous land defense movement in Canada called Idle No More. And they have a campaign called One House, Many Nations. And one of the key tenets and kind of principles behind it is that stable housing is a part of stable healthcare. And for community members in Indigenous communities on reservations, like the added stress, anxiety, and health impacts of not having like secure, stable housing is a huge issue, especially for women. So, and that's a women-led organization that we're working with. So like that's been a key focus for them. And then the work that we've been doing with the Minnesota Design Center and the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities around homelessness is also tied to equitable health and housing through the Envision Project, which is led by Dr. William Walsh. So, I mean, it's at the focus of all of the work that we're doing on homelessness and on kind of radically more affordable housing, both in Minnesota as well as the work that we're doing in Canada. So as Katie said, my name is Jacob Manns. I'm a assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm also a licensed architect, and I'm working on also becoming somewhat of a builder to try and help out with some of these issues, connecting the dots between engagement, design, production, to get to a more affordable housing model. And I wanted to go through a number of different things in the time that I had. The first thing being something that is maybe a little bit counterintuitive coming from a faculty member and researcher, but I think one of the biggest issues that we need to talk more about is ignorance, and the production of it, and how it is in our lives and in the way that we think and in the way that we design and come up with solutions. And I would encourage everybody. I'm working with my students this year and kind of producing an entire lecture on ignorance for almost all of my courses to help contextualize the production of knowledge around the production of ignorance. And a couple of different, there's a couple of different things I want to say around it. So one kind of ignorance that I think is really important is ignorance as a selective construct. It's our choice to prioritize certain kinds of knowledge or to choose not to learn certain types of things. So it's either I know something and I choose not to act on it, or I choose to only learn a certain set of things. And that's actually a particular kind of ignorance. It builds a particular kind of ignorance in us. It creates bias because we prioritize whatever we know and we apply that information in our personal lives, in our worldviews, and in the solutions that we come up with for the communities that we serve. So I think it's really important to kind of understand the role of the things that you choose not to act on and the things that you choose not to learn, and how they actually affect the knowledge that you use to create solutions. The other piece of ignorance that I think is really, really important, especially today, is manufactured ignorance. And I don't want to get into the politics of everything, but both sustainability and housing are, you can't have a conversation with them about talking about the kind of narratives that are manufactured around them to, I think, prevent a kind of common like joint effort towards addressing them. Like, it's very difficult to have meaningful conversations about the environment and sustainability when you see, like a large portion of the population, presenting a different narrative that's not aligned with science or facts or what the research is telling us. So that is one particular kind of manufactured ignorance that I think we have to find a way of addressing and dealing with if we're going to work together towards some shared solution on the climate change sustainability side of it. And I think it also applies in a big way to homelessness and the narratives that surround the people who are homeless and why they are homeless, and the kinds of houses that they should be given and what they deserve. Like, I hear this narrative working for both homeless people in the Twin Cities and for working with Indigenous communities, that there are just these kind of narratives that surround certain populations that it makes it very difficult to like find a way of unpacking these problems and solving these solutions if half of the people, not half of the people, but a large people of proportion of the people that you're working with are being controlled by this misinformation or manipulation of information about a certain group of people. So I think that's a really important thing. And I'm going to end my talk on ignorance as well and talk about it in a more productive way, but it can be very harmful, right? The sort of lack of knowledge or the manipulation of information. As Katie also mentioned, I've been doing quite a bit of work in Greater Minnesota through Spark and the Minnesota, hold on one second, buddy. I'm talking right now. Can you just let me finish? Nope, in a little bit. Just, okay. So through Spark and through the RSDPs, the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships at the University of Minnesota, we've been looking at doing a statewide resilient housing project, trying to connect with communities from around Minnesota and all of the 5 different regions that the University of Minnesota Extension identifies. And let's find a project where we can each talk about housing, talk about our own specific housing needs and challenges, how our cultures define housing in different ways, but then also try and find a way of coming to some shared solutions. I am an architect. I do believe that like design can play a huge role in this. And I think we need to find ways of sharing the knowledge that we create around housing and making solutions that can be universal and scaled to save on cost. I think one of the challenges with architecture and housing is that I think architects engage in something like 1% of the houses that are built, which is like a shockingly low percentage when you think of like how we're trained and what we talk about. But it's not set up in our business model to serve very well people who can't afford the design of a house. Like, we tend to work with people who can afford to pay, 10 to 15% on top of whatever their house costs to, to pay for our design services. So we need to look for other models. And I think a big part of that would be finding solutions that we could scale and share at a larger level. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do with this statewide housing project is both identify local solutions, but also look at some shared solutions that might help us scale and work utilizing advanced technology and modular design to get to some more affordable design solutions. As a big part of this, I think one thing that we're also very excited to do with communities is to work with them on asking them what a house is. Like, this gets back to my comment on bias and people having ideas about how people should live. And I think Colleen mentioned it like very succinctly, that different people, different cultures, different family sizes and styles have different housing needs. And we prescribe on top of people a very set definition of what housing is. So I think that there needs to be a fundamental like re-questioning of housing before we can meaningfully engage in like a new set of solutions that could push it forward. And those have to address things like cost and sustainability and the kind of carbon accounting of these different things. I think it's gonna result in some big changes. But I think if we don't take the time to step back and ask some fundamentally different questions about housing, then it's going to be very hard to overcome some of the cost burdens that we're dealing with and actually provide stable housing for different groups of people who have not, been traditionally asked what kinds of housing they need to live in. And this is one of the really fantastic parts about the Envision project that I referenced earlier in the Twin Cities, is that it's always engaged with Street Voices of Change. They're a group of homeless activists who represent every design decision on the project. They're at the table with the architects and designers. When the project was presented to the Institute of Architects at the convention last fall, there were members from Street Voices of Change, people who have lived and experienced homelessness, talking to architects right alongside, of the architects who signed the drawings that we sent out to be produced. So I think, how we ask and who we ask about what a house is really, really important. Going back to that, I think also how we define sustainability is very important. And this might be somewhat controversial. I know that we're all seeking to find solutions that are less environmentally impactful through energy efficiency strategies. But I think, again, like that as the starting point is maybe not the most effective way of moving forward. If you kind of look at systems thinking and large scale complex systems, we know that you can't just take individual pieces out of those equations, make them efficient and plug them back in and have the entire system work more efficiently. And this is one of the big things that we're talking about right now with the tiny houses, small scale houses that we're trying to design for homeless people. It's like, okay, these people, they're homeless. Like, where should the money go? Should the money go to making it incredibly energy efficient, to reducing operational costs? Like, that makes sense if you look at it one way, but at the extent of providing, an extra house for every 3 passive houses that we produce, if we would have produced a slightly less efficient one, we could have made 2 like code compliant houses. And that's the conversation I want us to be having as well. It's like, what is the question that we're trying to solve? Who are we talking about sustainable architecture with? Is it like for the people who can afford architectural services and to solicit like what we would typically think of as green design, or is it to get people into housing, which I think is a different definition of sustainability, and we need to focus on the bigger outcomes, and that might mean some counterintuitive thinking about some of the other ways that we've been thinking about building sustainability and building efficiency for the last couple of decades. So the last thing I want to do, and kind of coming back to ignorance before I close up and hand it back over to Katie, is I think ignorance is also a very virtuous thing that we can hold on to. One of the books that I read when I was doing my master's thesis a few years ago was called The Virtues of Ignorance. It was by Wes Jackson and Bill Vidocq. And Wes Jackson had this statement at the very beginning of the book that said, "We are billions of times more ignorant than we are knowledgeable. Why don't we go with our strong suit?" And for me, it's like, it's never left my mind. Like, we should be designing for the unknown. We should be designing for the second or the third use of a space, not the first use, because like that's what we're handing on to our kids and our kids' kids. And when you look at really innovative thinkers today, people in Silicon Valley, people who are developing, cutting edge technology, yes, they rely on experts, but they're also really, really focused on certain kinds of ignorance, like achieving this kind of condition of neoteny where, which is basically like a child's mind state where you're able to put aside all of your expertise and all of your bias because it's built into you through your education and your profession, and look at a problem objectively, come up with a new solution, and then work towards a more meaningful set of outcomes with a broader, maybe post-disciplinary network of people to come to some set of conclusions. So I'll hand it back over, and yeah, thanks for your time and for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I know there's a question waiting for us, but we will answer all the questions at the end. So a very good question. So we'll look forward to talking more about that. Our last speaker today is Rachel Wagner. She is the founder and owner of Through Design LLC and has made a career in sustainable design and sustainable building. So I will turn it to Rachel.
Hi, I think I'm on.
Yes.
Great. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I'll start with just a very brief little bit more information about me. I spent over 2 decades as a designer and architect focusing on residential design, and in particular focusing on resource efficient, sustainable residential design. And as a couple of our previous speakers alluded to, most of my work served people in the top 10% or so of the economic sphere of our country. This allowed me to do things that I think were ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. And so I'm very grateful for the work that I was able to do. The better I got at what I did, the more experience I got and the more people I touched, I sort of assumed that the type of design I was doing was going to become the new normal. And as I'm sure everybody in this webinar recognizes, it is anything but. As I became more uncomfortable with what I was doing because of who and what I was not reaching, I decided to leave my practice 2 years ago. And that's when I started Through Design. And I wanted the opportunity to use my experience, my technical expertise, and also my personal passions to have a broader impact, and essentially created Through Design to focus on the intersecting issues around design, education, sustainability, and justice. I'm going to talk mainly today about one initiative that has come out of my work with Through Design, which is Green New Deal housing. Green New Deal housing formed about a year ago. I am a co-founder and a board member of this new nonprofit community development organization. We have not built any homes yet. We're located in Duluth, Minnesota. We are hoping to begin construction next year, but we're much more than a housing organization. And hopefully when you learn a little bit about Green New Deal housing, you will perhaps see one model that I think addresses and answers the calls that the previous speakers today have put forth to all of us. And I definitely believe there is more than one answer. There are going to have to be many, many answers. And I think this is why the Green New Deal is a fitting paradigm. Next slide, please. So the Green New Deal is a framework that was put forward in Congress a couple of years ago, but really entered the public discourse more than a decade ago. I believe that the first time the phrase Green New Deal was kind of put out there was in 2007 by the Minnesota author Tom Friedman. And when our hosts put the early slide up talking about what this sustainable development initiative at the university entailed and the bigger paradigm that it was part of, talking about it being both a local to global context, but focusing on 17 global goals. I was really heartened to see that pretty much all 17 of those global goals are referenced in narratives around the idea of a Green New Deal. The 5 main tenets that I've outlined in this slide are paraphrased from newconsensus.com, which is a think tank that is doing a fair amount of work with members of Congress to put forward ideas about policy and massive framework intersecting systemic change, recognizing that work that needs to be done to address the climate crisis is only going to be successful and can only be successful if it simultaneously addresses other crises of our time. And I think putting them all under sustainability, including social sustainability, is a fair way of looking at it. So this paradigm of the Green New Deal got me excited as a way to think about affordable housing and think about a way of broadening not just the definition of affordable housing and sustainable housing, but what housing is linked to and how tied it is to so many other, I think, metrics and indicators of social health. And I guess we can go next slide. A big piece of the work that I've been doing kind of challenges the notion of historically the definition of the word affordable when we talk about affordable housing. I really think about housing in the sense of a basic welfare. And I would say that there are some basic welfare and basic needs that we are all entitled to. And Green New Deal housing is trying to address all of these. And I would identify those as a right to secure, stable shelter, clean air and water, access to food, access to safety, access to community, and access to agency within that community. So thinking back again to those 17 pieces of sustainable development and how intersecting and interrelated so many of these issues are, another way of putting it, and the way that we have tried to go about our work with creating this organization, Green New Deal Housing, is with the words of naturalist John Muir. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And I think there's 2 really important ways of approaching work using this statement. The first is if you want to successfully take care of something, for instance, if you want to successfully really make an impact where and how it's most needed with affordable and sustainable housing, it can't be done effectively without also simultaneously addressing certain other issues. Conversely, if you hone in sort of microscopically or on one issue, or myopically, some of us might say, and focus entirely on one issue without understanding and acknowledging the other systems that are so integral and related to it, you will fail even at that one thing that you're focused on because you aren't seeing the rest of the big picture and what's impacted. So with that in mind, we set about creating a new community housing organization that addressed these 5 tenets of the Green New Deal. And what I'm going to do with my remaining time is speak very briefly about these pieces and how they are part of the program that we are moving forward and will soon be launching in the next month or so. Next slide. So affordable homes. This is a very short and simple list of what we're doing. There'll be much more detail on our website, which will be launched in about 2 weeks, greennewdealhousing.org. So We're beginning with single family homes on infill lots, scattered sites, I think one of the other speakers mentioned. So these are existing lots within the city of Duluth. Once we get a number of houses built and really sort of have honed our systems, we intend to expand to multifamily housing, possibly mixed use, cluster housing developments, and small houses, accessory dwelling units, or perhaps, I don't know that I'm going to go so far as to say tiny homes, but even smaller homes. And our initial home designs are quite small. So these houses are all extremely energy efficient, durable, solar optimized, and net zero capable, meaning that they are designed with an appropriately sized PV system to be either roof mounted to the house or in locations where that's not possible because we can't get enough solar gain on those roofs. We are going to be investing in community solar gardens, which is another sort of broad-based way of integrating, bringing more people into the framework of renewable energy. So a couple of big pieces differentiate the way that we're doing our homes, we believe. And that is, the first is that these houses will be sold at a sliding scale. Income qualified homeowners will have a dramatically reduced price. People who do not require a subsidy can also buy the homes at market rate. We're also going to be selling plans or licensing plans to other nonprofit developers and for-profit developers at extremely low prices, so that we can kind of expand the scale of this kind of building. We've come up with a series of construction assemblies and materials that have been used over and over again in our cold climate. We energy model each house design so that we know where we're landing in terms of predicted energy performance, but we're building all of these structures the same way. This does a few things. It means we can provide extremely well-crafted details and assemblies, specifications, notes, and instruction on how to build the home, because unlike, and Jacob mentioned this, unlike a custom architect design home where the details are constantly changing, not only from house to house, but sometimes within the same house, we're coming up with really durable, high-performance details that will then be repeated across every house. So once a builder builds one of these, if he or she is going to build another one, they already know what materials they're going to be using, what the assemblies are. They can get their crews and their subcontractors really comfortable with these assemblies. Next slide, please. So we have some taglines that we're developing. We don't just build homes, we're training the next generation of home builders. We, in Duluth, and I think statewide, there is a shortage of construction workforce and tradespeople. And so traditionally, construction trades are good paying, secure jobs. We also know that BIPOC population, women and other people from non-dominant communities are really, really underrepresented in the construction trades workforce. So we are offering free construction and training for existing professionals, but also partnering with organizations to work with workforce development and bringing in new potential workers to teach them sustainable construction and help prepare them for the workforce transition that, again, is needed tremendously as we repair infrastructure, as we prepare for renewable energy transformation. Next slide, please. So an umbrella kind of around all of this is social justice. And we began this concept of Green New Deal housing and working with the tenants of the Green New Deal and really, really kind of fleshing out how we wanted to approach this about 18 months ago. When COVID-19 hit, we were sort of floored watching how much of the social contract or how the fragility of what we had hoped was a social contract, watching things unravel and watching once again who disproportionately was affected by COVID-19. Then when one more Black man, George Floyd, was murdered and we saw the uprising around that, we, meaning the board of Green New Deal Housing, felt that much more strongly that the work that we were going to do needed to stand right in alignment with these social justice movements and not back away from stating that we are taking this on with this kind of a housing organization that's focused on working in communities that have been marginalized and underinvested in historically and systematically, that we are bringing the same kind and quality of houses to the wealthy neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods, and that most importantly, we're engaging the workers, we're engaging the community members in these underserved communities to engage with us and reach and bring the kind of investment that's been lacking for so long. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that a fair amount of my work was done in sustainability, and yes, climate change mitigation is absolutely at the forefront of this, and a big piece of it has to do with the fact that nearly 40% of all US energy consumption and CO2 emissions come from the construction and operation of buildings. About 20% of all CO2 emissions is from homes. So houses, buildings are a really, really big piece of the problem, and it is rarely talked about. Most people recognize the contributions of the fossil fuel industry, of electricity generation, of cars and transportation, airplanes, but very few people recognize the impact that buildings have on climate change and therefore resiliency. If we don't tackle this in a systematic way, we are not going to solve the crisis, which is right here, right now. Next slide. So part of that solution is clean energy. And we're kind of saying we're bringing the clean energy revolution into every home we build. All Green New Deal homes are all electric. There is no gas in these houses, meaning if you're putting a new home into an existing infill site, we are literally not connecting to the gas line. We are counting on beneficial electrification along with the solar PV panels for each home, that all of our homes have the ability from day one to be zero net energy. And as the grid transitions to be 100% renewable energy, then we will be zero carbon. Next. Community benefit. Working in this way, in a systemic way, not just where and how many houses we build, but how we engage and where we engage, has tremendous benefit, not just to individual homeowners, but to the community as a whole. And going back to this notion of sort of systemic thinking and interrelatedness, literally our whole communal future depends on what we're doing now and making big, systemic, fundamental changes. So that's my last slide. We can go out of the slide presentation. Thank you so much for letting me participate in this. I guess, you know, I would just want to close by saying that I feel like the previous speaker, Jacob, said a lot of things that I could have said as well. So thank you for that. I think that it's really, really important to recognize that there is expertise both on the ground in communities, in the non-academic world and in the academic world, and absolutely that by putting shared solutions into the public realm and the public discourse, I think we can make some really fundamental, lasting, sustainable change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and all our panelists. It was really lots of really good information and interesting perspectives. We do have a few questions and we have a few minutes, so that's about perfect. The first one is a very serious one, and so I know this may not be easy to answer in a short amount of time, but a very thoughtful question. So, with the heavy associated environmental and financial costs of both transportation and overconsumption, how do we best balance a community to be sustainable while ensuring accessibility to resources and not falling into the traps of overdevelopment? How can we ensure communities have their needs fulfilled but are not pushing out those who are at risk financially and destroying the environment?
Yeah, I just have one thought on that. Yeah, really complex question, but it would have to be around engagement and getting those more vulnerable or people who are at risk, having their voices at the planning table so that they're not overshadowed by the people who have more power, like in that planning process. Otherwise it would be very difficult because if their interests aren't represented, then whatever development gets planned is going to follow the interests of the other groups. There's just no way around it. So it feels like it's, through an engagement, through a design process that's inclusive and people-centered, that you would potentially have some influence over gentrification and other kinds of, negative development that you might want to avoid.
If I could add one piece to that as well, I think it has to do with where we're putting our dollars, where we're investing, both governmentally, locally, and I think this is where people can really participate at the local level, talking to your mayor, your council members, to foundations. I don't want to sort of get things too riled up here, but the phrase that's becoming more well known now of defund the police, what it's talking about in a lot of ways is saying we are a very, very wealthy country and we are putting a lot of money into things that do not support community stability, security, or sustainability. If we all sort of push for a reallocation of money, I think that we can address these issues, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of shouting and a lot of persistence on the part of many of us who I think have not engaged in this way in the past.
If I could add to that, I've heard from a lot of the housing folks in the past. I just want to appreciate what Jacob and Rachel have just talked about, where it's really an issue of moving the money where the money is at. So you can spend money on healthcare, but are we accurately spending money on healthcare when really, if we were building housing, we wouldn't need the kinds of healthcare services we are using? So I think it's that, how do you fix the upstream issues and get to that? And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing an erosion of the upstream factors that then lead to really poor health outcomes. So instead of studying the problem, which we've been doing as a state for a while, we really need to take action on getting initiatives and innovative solutions moving forward. And I think we knew this was a crisis 2 years ago, and now it's worse, right? Because of COVID, because of the economic downturn. And I still think we have an option in the state to really put a more coordinated, integrated network and solutions forward. Because I think that's the challenge that I've seen, is that the investment really has to be made in housing.
Thanks. There's a couple questions that you guys could maybe just jot some notes into. So I'll just leave those for you guys to type answers if you have them. One is if you have any ideas on getting involved in St. Paul. And then another question on where in Duluth you're constructing these houses. So I'll let you guys type those answers if you have them. And another on where you're getting funding for the Green New Deal. This is another interesting question. For the Green New Deal, you mentioned creating good high-wage jobs. You talked about construction jobs, which is great, but I was wondering if there are other kinds of jobs or training being planned for populations where a job as physical as construction isn't feasible, particularly as she's asking about older populations of people who can no longer do that kind of work, and that there's a lot of hopelessness in that population. So not sure construction jobs is a good option. So it's in some ways it's a question of that connection to jobs and employment and housing?
I can definitely answer some of that. So it takes an awful lot of work to create community development besides just the sort of, figurative and literal boots on the ground, construction, trades, jobs. There are sort of background office type work. There's sales, there's real estate, there is development, there's financing. There is community outreach and efforts. There are design related jobs. There's training. So, people who can become involved in helping in the training. So if we have folks who used to be in construction and can't physically do the work anymore, but have some expertise to share. And the renewable energy industry also, there is tremendous job opportunity there. In 2019, they were expecting Minnesota jobs in renewable energy to continue to rise at a greater rate than in the rest of the country. I just saw those numbers and it was surprising. The jobs fell slightly in 2019, but it was by like less than 1%. So it was really still a small number. And I think we can assume that renewable energy jobs in Minnesota are going to continue to grow. And again, in the renewable energy industry, there are jobs in design, sales, production, manufacturing, and installation.
Any other thoughts from our
I just wanted to add a little bit on that. Some of the project work that we've been doing on Canada with the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, we have similar issues come up where parts of the community aren't physically able to help with the construction of the units that we've been working on. And I think one of the conversations that evolved from that was, we're not building houses, we're building community. We're looking at the village structure, and there's all kinds of things that go beyond just constructing houses that are a part of making a community. So it could be good preparation. It could be like, in terms of the community up there, just getting elders to be able to speak with younger children about the culture of the community and the history of that and language. And I mean, it's, in that regard, I think like we found ways of looking at labor a little bit more complexly. It's not just like the physical labor of like pounding nails, but there are all other types of things that people can do to contribute to a community project that go beyond the building of houses. The house is like an outcome, like one outcome, but a stronger community would, I think, be the end goal. I don't know how that translates into like long-term, like sustainable employment, but for some kinds of project work, like if you frame it in that way, I think you can engage a much broader audience in the production of housing.
We have one more minute. I don't know if Colleen, you had anything to add to that. Otherwise, I think we will.
Well, it was more around the job market and thinking through this. I kind of very similarly, I would say healthcare is in a very similar spot. There are positions I would say that should be, if they're not already, opening up around like community health workers, where people can be retrained and really kind of be the connectors for various group of people. And so I do think you have to, if you think broadly, there are lots of roles within that I think need to be filled and thought through to keep care going. And again, care from a very holistic, community-centered way.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to all our panelists. We really, really appreciate your joining us today. If you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to the panelists individually. We won't have any more time for questions today, but lots of good questions and engagement. Thank you for that. I also wanted to acknowledge our hosts of today's webinar, which was the Office of Public Engagement here at the University of Minnesota. So they've been collaborating with us on these webinars. We do have another webinar coming up, so please join us on October 22nd. We are going to be focusing that talk on climate change. Thank you very much, and thank you again to our panelists for joining us today.